Today's reading from the Song of the Abhidhut, and the Abhidhut Dattatreya continues with his instruction. You may be young, unlearned, and addicted to pleasures. You may be a servant or a householder. It doesn't matter. Does a jewel require a guru in order to be valuable? Or is it worthless simply because it's covered with mud? You may lack learning or literary skill. You don't require such qualities as these. Hold fast to the truth and let go of all else. Even an unpainted boat will take you across. The self appears as both the animate and the inanimate world, yet it always remains in its own peaceful state. It is always pure consciousness, as calm as the sky. Though appearing as the animate and the inanimate world, the self remains forever one. Where then is the division? There is no duality. It is clear to me. Indeed, I am the highest truth. I am that. I contain the world, both subtle and gross. I do not come, nor do I go. I have no movement. I have no form. I am unaffected by my component parts. Therefore, though the gods may worship me in my perfect wholeness, I recognize no such distinctions. Neither doubt nor ignorance can cause the slightest ripple in me. Let the modifications of the mind continue to occur. They are merely bubbles rising to the surface of a pond. The ephemeral elements that form all things manifest in many different ways. Some things appear soft, others are hard. Some things appear sweet, and others sour. The qualities of clearness, coldness, and softness are but qualities of water. Likewise, matter and spirit are but qualities of the one existence. Beyond all speech, beyond all names, beyond the subtlest of all subtle things, beyond mind, intellect, and the five senses, the stainless Lord of the universe remains ever one. If the universal self becomes known, how could I continue to be? How could you, or the sentient and insentient world, still be? The self is said to be like the sky. Indeed, it is like the sky. It's pure consciousness, without any stain. It is truly the all-embracing whole. It remains unaffected, though it takes the form of earth, air, water, and fire. Though it takes all these forms, it remains always the same. All infinite space is pervaded by the self, but nothing else pervades the self. It is simultaneously within and without. It cannot be limited or divided in parts. It is extremely subtle and cannot be seen. It's primary to all qualities, the yogis say. It is the state that underlies all other temporary states of mind. By practicing yoga, union, unceasingly, without attachment to anything, little by little, a yogi is freed from all effects of the qualities such as restlessness or torpor. Against the dreadful poison of worldly lust which deludes minds, there is only one antidote: the awareness of the independent self. The subtle images are seen within, and the manifold forms are seen without. but the independent experiencer of both is known by all the seers as the inner self. Experienced without, it is the universe. Experienced within, it's the power of life. And deep within that inner life, the real milk of the coconut resides. The outer knowledge is of the coconut's husk. The subtler knowledge is the meat within. And concealed within that subtle core is the coconut milk of consciousness, the self. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Welcome. In this chapter of Avadhuta Gita, the Avadhuta is still pointing us continuously to the recognition that the self is all, and the self is only really known within. And so he's encouraging us to drop all our stories about the world, about ourselves, about our bodies and our minds, and to keep coming back to this recognition. I am the self. Now again, the self is just a word, isn't it? And sometimes this word causes confusion because it gets used interchangeably with the words that are the indicators for the mysterious in all of the traditions. So it gets mixed up with God, it gets mixed up with emptiness, it gets mixed up with non-self. But in each of the traditions, the words that are used to indicate something to the people that are present, to the practitioners, according to that tradition, according to what's known in that culture. So there's a lot of things that go into the decision by someone who's sharing this knowledge about whether it's called the Absolute, or it's called God, or it's called emptiness, or it's called the Self. But just understand the point that needs to be made is that there is this inner knowing. We talked about it a little last week. Referenced it just as simple knowing, so that we couldn't put any kind of a definitive mental label on it. But there's just this acknowledgement that I'm that which is aware. And this awareness, which is referred to in all of the religions, in all of the spiritual traditions by different names, according to the different experiences of the people who are practicing. But always, there's this return to the inner knowledge. There's this withdrawal, if you will, of attention from being enamored of and attracted to the circumstances, the experiences in the world. And again, this is not to say that they're bad, right? Because the Avadhuta is what's saying throughout this particular piece that I am both that which is aware and all of that which I am aware of. But all of the traditions indicate by their practices and by their teachings that in order to know the self, in order to know the Absolute, in order to know yourself as consciousness, as being, consciousness, bliss, you must be willing to surrender this interest in the world, in the goings-on of the world. When you surrender this interest, however, does that mean that the world will stop, that you'll stop having a life? I'm talking about this today because this question has come up a few times in the past week. I'm so happy to see and talk with a number of you and with some other people who are further away that are watching at a distance, that people are very much engaged in this inquiry now. And one of the things that's come up this week in spades is that people are beginning to confront their own boredom, their own recognition that they're losing interest in the things which have interested them in the past. And of course I've talked about this last week and I'll talk about it again today, that this is one of the indicators that your inquiry is taking root. But there's another side of it, and that side that people are reporting is common, and that is that when we begin to lose interest in the world around us as a form of practice, we start to take attention off of that and come directly, moment by moment, back into the stillness of our own awareness. There can be different things that arise for different people. For some people it's fear that arises. Well, if I'm not my experience and I'm not pursuing anything, I've come to a stop in some way, then who am I? The interesting thing is that what's also being reported is at this point of understanding, there still isn't a recognition that the practice or the inquiry remains the same at this point. This is why it leads to fear, is because the identity, the ego, which has been guiding you throughout all of your life, starts to see itself dissolve, and rather than continue the inquiry, what is aware of this dissolution? What happens is the fear comes up, and it's the fear that if I dissolve, I will be no one. I will have no life, I will be totally bored, I will be boring, this also comes up. I won't be able to keep my relationships going, and so on. So I just want to remind you this week that as you continue with this, that when you reach these kind of inflection points, the question of the inquiry is always, and what is aware of this? It's that question, or who am I? But in this case, the question, and what is aware of this, works particularly well. What is aware of this fear? What is aware of this emotional sense of being disconnected from the world? What is this fear that arises when I sense that I maybe am withdrawing in some way from the things which in the past have stimulated me, given me pleasure, that I've found interesting, that I have formulated my perception of my personal identity around? What happens when these things begin to collapse? When I actually begin to step not into the concept of there is nothing, or I am emptiness, or there is only emptiness, there is only what is rolling along, but there is fear related to that because of the dissolution that's happening. We must continue always to ask ourselves, and what is aware of this? So at every junction, the question remains the same while the experiences change. This is the heart and the meat of the practice of inquiry. That is, first of all, for us to acknowledge that through our experience, back over many, many years of looking back over our experiences and our history, we can see that the only thing that's ever remained is our awareness of our own experience. That's all that's remained. The experiences themselves are gone. They have left long ago. But because we can bring them up again, or they can come up again spontaneously on their own, we have this indicator that in all of our experiences, the constant is that we're aware. I am aware as this, whatever this is. We don't need to name it as consciousness or the absolute or God or emptiness or anything else. We just need to know, I am aware. I was aware then, I am aware now. What I'm aware of is of secondary importance. So as you continue, as some of you have reported in this past week, and you've come up against these walls of fear and doubt, doubt's another major one that comes up when we get to this point, just continue. What is aware of this doubt? What is aware of this fear? Don't be afraid to name it, because that can be a help to know what you are experiencing at that moment, what's arising in awareness for you. It's actually arising in mind, but awareness is the root of that. So what's arising in mind and heart right now might be doubt, it might be fear, it might be uncertainty. All of these things can come up, and they do come up, and they come up quickly, and sometimes they come up with great force. That does not change the inquiry. Come back to what is stable and what is solid by asking the question, and what is aware of this? If you just simply try to figure out, using mind, how to escape the fear, your old habit patterns are going to return. So whatever you've used in the past to escape fear, whether it's self-medication of some sort, could be even deep samadhi states. All sorts of spiritual states can also be used as a form of self-medication in a way, as a way of stepping aside from what is, because fear has arisen or doubt has arisen. And so we go, when we're uncertain, towards some sort of practice which calms the mind and calms the body, and of course this is good. But then once we hit that state or that place that we're familiar with, we stop inquiring. We're stuck in the pleasure loop. So I'm just encouraging you now, since some of you are very deep in the inquiry now, that no matter what comes up for you, no matter what the mind tells you about it, oh, I should stop because there's too much fear here, oh, I'm going to dissolve and I'll be nobody and nothing and I'll just be a boring person sitting on the street corner. Whatever is coming up, the response for you as a sada is what is aware of this. The reason this is effective is because the only thing that will not change is awareness itself. Everything else will eventually go. So you could just as easily in some way say, and this too shall pass. You can remind yourself of that if you're particularly in a difficult moment. This too shall pass. But follow it, if you want to go deeper, with the inquiry. Who or what is aware of this thought, this emotion, this state of mind? Eventually, you become very, very stable, and you let go. You just let everything flow as it is, and you remain as awareness itself. It's pretty straightforward, and it's not as difficult as it sounds, but you must be persistent. So for those of you who are at this place this week, persist with the question. So I had a conversation yesterday with Louisa, and we happened to be at the farmer's market, and it was around this topic in a certain way, as I understood it. And one of the things that I was able to point out in that situation, I was able to just say, just look around. And all the people, you've all been to the farmer's market, so you know what it's like at the farmer's market. There's lots of activity, lots of joy, lots of music, lots of things are going on in the world. And I was able to say, just look around and see this. Because there's this question of, but I don't feel like This was not her question, but this comes up. But I don't feel like I can connect anymore. I don't feel like I belong. I feel like because I'm doing this inquiry and looking inside all the time that I can't really relate to this. This is the wrong question. Why can't I relate to this anymore? Right? The question you need to ask is, what is aware of this? And when you ask this question, or who is aware of this, you can stand in that situation and you can see all of life. Not I am separate from this, but that I am the awareness of all of this, and all of this is awareness itself, and this is life itself in its dance. Now this becomes a joy. Now everything that's coming is just myself. I have nothing to fear, nothing to doubt, nothing to look away from, nothing to even consider. This is just the dance of life. It's just happening. So take the time from time to time to stop your mind when you're walking about doing your job, when you're just out in the world, you're in the grocery store. Remind yourself to stop in that moment, drop your agenda for a moment, leave your list to the side, and just look. And now ask the question, what is aware of this? This will eventually lead you to the place where you can see that all of life is spontaneously arising, and you are just a part of that. And it's not even you. This is all just life. Your personality is absolutely unnecessary in most situations. And even if you drop your personality completely and have no response, no reaction, no statement or comment in the mind about what you're observing, you will still be aware. This is how you become firmly entrenched, firmly standing on this foundation of awareness, as you simply allow everything to be. Your heart, your mind, your experience, the world, allowing it all to be. And now for you there's this joy of recognition that I'm here, and all of this is myself. I'm not separate. I don't need to be separate. I am naturally unified with all of life. Some circumstances, this will draw you further in to whatever is happening in your life in that moment. At other times, you will just wait and stand back and experience the joy of being in the world as you are, without interference from this personal identity. You are the self. You're not what's being experienced. The experiences you're having, they cannot harm you. If you remain as awareness. If you know simply, I am here, and this here-ness, this now-ness, is the truth. It doesn't even require me. It doesn't require my opinions. All of life simply is.
my experience keeps practice of what you're describing, to the degree that I'm able to be diligent with it, it still occurs as a sensation of thought. Like and which lends itself to residing in thought as opposed to awareness. It feels like I get very close. It's like
So
I'm
describe to
imagining-
me, yeah. So describe to me the sensation of thought. I want to know what this sensation of thought, what you're describing there.
Well, you know, typically with that practice that you're describing is an experience of an idea getting simpler and simpler and simpler, and maybe coming close to being able to transition to an atmosphere of just sensation, but it seems to always kind of somehow I tend to stay in a perception of idea. And I'm only imagining that there's something else based on these other moments of experience that kind of occur sort of peripherally or incidentally.
Yeah, and we've spoken about this before, you and
Yeah.
I, so they occur rather spontaneously.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And the minute I become aware of them and think about them, they're gone.
Of course. This is the nature of grasping with the
Yeah.
mind.
But that happens a lot in this practice, and
Yes.
I'm imagining this practice at some point might lend itself to flipping into that other experience.
Yes, but how?
Yes, I don't know. I just keep doing this little loop by this.
Okay, so understand now, right now, that was one big long thought you had there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And you finished it.
I think so.
What's there now?
Anticipation of the great. Of some understanding that I don't have. Hope.
But this is important to notice, because as we consider these things in the mind, we can only consider the structure of our question for a certain period of time. So, you asked this question, you gave several points along the way of this consideration, right? And this happens. And then you said, and the mind then anticipates, right? An answer. You're not anticipating the answer long enough. And you're wanting the answer to be in thought. In other words, in a form I can recognize in my mind. But the answer, I'm using that term really loosely, because you're using the term answer in terms of thought structure, a form I can understand in my mind. I'm using the term answer in terms of ultimate truth, which may or may not have a thought structure associated with it. When you come to the end of the question that you have in your own mind, your own consideration, what if you let the mind go ahead and ask this elaborate question, and then you did nothing but wait? Now what happens?
I don't know. Nothing so far.
And what's the problem with that? You see, there is a problem associated with that for you. Otherwise, you wouldn't pick up the thinking. You wouldn't come close to this moment of beingness and then go back into thinking. So what's the problem?
There's something resembling a tickle that stirs me. It's not a physical tickle, it's
Mhm.
something, but metaphorically speaking, I would describe it as a tickle and I get uncomfortable.
And? What's the problem?
I don't stay still.
And now what's the problem? You see, as soon as you associate anything with a problem, it just begins to look for justification for the problem. The mind begins to look for, why am I not getting this? Why am I wiggling here in my cushion or whatever? Just begins that whole story. So, for you, becomes incumbent to just wait. This is in Advaita the final answer anyway. Let everything resolve itself in silence. But this is not the easiest thing to do, right? Simple to say, let everything resolve itself in silence. But for someone with a mind like that, like you're describing, like you have, if I say, and so what? And I push you back into waiting, what happens? What? You start laughing. What's the laugh about?
My obligation to have an answer.
Uh-huh. Yes. Okay, so I give you permission to not have an answer. You're free of that obligation. Now what?
I'll report back next week.
No. You can't slip out the door now. You can't get out the door now. No.
I feel that tickle, that thing.
And what is aware of that? Don't look at the tickle. What's aware of it?
I don't know what that is.
Great. Sit there for a minute. Sit there in that don't know. You see, we aren't obliged to follow our thoughts. As much as we're conditioned by our lives, our families, our school, our work and everything to think that we are absolutely obligated to look at whatever's happening in body, mind, and world and follow it. We are not obligated to that. If you don't follow that sense of obligation, are you not aware? Is your awareness dependent upon you thinking? Or figuring something out? Or meeting your responsibilities? If you're an irresponsible person, do you become less aware? I'm not encouraging you to become an irresponsible person. I don't want to shock you too much. But if you don't have that sense of obligation around what's happening in body, mind, and world, do you somehow disappear? Well, you disappear, but does awareness disappear? You have to look. And I don't mean that you have to look and then think about it so you figure it out. I mean you have to give up the sense of obligation, give up the sense of responsibility for anything in this moment. You're not responsible for anything. If you're not responsible for anything, then how are you here? You see, the conditioning says, I'm responsible for everything, that's why I'm here. I'm saying the opposite to you. If you're not responsible for anything, then how are you here? You see, it's not your responsibility. You simply are. And as you are right now is perfect. Even you never figure out another thing in your life. Even you live the rest of your life responsible for the whole world, responsible for everything around you in that belief system. Even if you become completely irresponsible and reject all of it, how does this behavior change awareness? No matter how perfectly you as a personality behave or act, or no matter how poorly you as a personality behave or act, you will still be aware. Notice this. You were as aware in your worst moments, by your own definition, as you have been in your best moments. So those moments come and go. It is the awareness, the consciousness, which you are, which is unmoving. It's incumbent upon some of you now to begin to notice that you don't like being unmoving. And some of you know this, physically you have a really difficult time not moving. This is okay, but that's also an indicator that when you begin to not move in the mind, you will go in the direction that JB is talking about, which is trying to figure something out. You'll try to use the mind to interpret your experience. You'll call it boring, uninteresting. You'll say, I can't possibly be awake. I have to figure this out. You won't come back to what is aware of this whole dialogue. The mind is tricky this way. So how are you doing with not knowing now? You've been over there, I hope, not knowing for the last couple minutes? What's up now? Can you say anything about not knowing at all? Or about once you accept not knowing, what is your state then?
It's just a lot of the sensation. It's a kind of an emotional thing, both fear and desire kind of overwhelming.
All right, so now you understand that if you allow your mind to build that story up anymore, then other than just sharing it with me now, you're going to become uncomfortable more, right? Because the mind is going to generate exactly what you're describing. The sense of being uncomfortable, not knowing, of this being fearful. So, what's aware of this? You've now seen the mind, you just described what it was doing. Know that that's not you, that's the mind.
Yeah, I see that happening.
Yeah, and?
I don't know what that is. It's just witness.
Of course. You see, he's absolutely right. You cannot know what that is because you cannot turn awareness into the same object as you can with the mind. That's why the mind is so interesting. We can set it out there, or the world, or experience. We can set it out there and we can explore it. We can look at it in all of its glory. But then we forget that this is a mind game. This is not me. This is mind candy. I love this, so I'll just keep feeding it. But like chocolate, right? Like any kind of a sweetie, our 20th piece is never as good as our first piece. So, we eventually have to do something else because we've followed that line of thinking about it's fear, it's this and that. We can stay in that for hours, pursuing that, trying to figure out what's the matter, when in fact all we needed to do in the beginning was just drop it, was to see it as a mind projection, right? What's happening, according to Sri Ramana, is that we have forgotten we are the screen, and we think we are the movie. So he gives this example that if you know you are the screen, right, then the movie which is projected on the screen can be a blizzard. And it will look like what's on the screen is very cold, it's freezing. But the screen isn't impacted by it. Likewise, what can be projected on the screen is a forest fire. Everything can be aflame, burning. The screen isn't affected. So our task, in some ways, in using the inquiry to understand the truth of who we are and the truth of existence, is to come to understand that you are that screen. How do we do that? Well, if what's going across the mind is that particular movie, I don't know, I don't understand, I don't get this, I'm full of fear, this is confusing, I'm so uncertain. If that's the movie that's going across the screen, and we believe it, then it just has to run its course, doesn't it? And it will run its course, right? Eventually, if nothing else, whether we get an answer to that or not, we will just exhaust ourselves, and finally we'll go to sleep, and the next morning we'll wake up and that movie won't be on the screen anymore, right? Though we may have had to stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning rehashing the scenes of the movie, eventually we will fall asleep or whatever, or the movie will just, something else will supersede it. If we're out in the world and we're having all those kinds of thoughts, then something suddenly changes rapidly, in our world. Now attention will go to that, and we will completely forget that 5 minutes ago we were in that movie. Maybe it'll come back later, maybe not, right? So what we're doing here by asking this question, and what is aware of this, is always bringing the attention back to the screen, which is behind whatever movie is playing on the screen at that moment. This happens in a number of ways. We can ask ourselves, am I aware? What is aware? Who is aware? Or we can say, I am that which is aware. Pulling attention away from what the mind is discussing, annotating, considering. And there's a time for that. Understand, if you have to get on a plane, you have to make tickets, reservations, all of that kind of stuff. If you're running your business and there are things that need to be done, you have to employ the mind to do that. What we're talking about is those things that you're either not noticing or only noticing at certain times, which is that loop conversation that's going on in the mind behind everything that you're doing. So you're sitting on the computer getting your ticket for wherever you're going, but in the back of your mind you're wondering about what it's going to be like when you get there, or will I see this person, or when I see him, is he going to yell at me, or, right? The personal loop tape is going behind all the time. You can be standing and talking to me, and I can be standing and talking to you, and both of us can have loop tapes going on about something else, right? You've all had that experience. Well, this is a way to bring an end to that kind of mental exercise. By asking the question, what is aware of this? Or noticing, I am that which is aware. What happens is, those loop tapes come to an end. Your activity in the world may not. But you won't have the loop tape going in the background of everything that you're doing, trying to figure it out, trying to understand it, trying to come to a conclusion, trying to formulate an opinion about it. You'll just simply let things be, and you will rest as you are, as awareness. When it's time for you to speak, you will speak. When it's time for you to act, you will act. In between, you come to silence. So how is it now?
Peaceful. With you talking, it's easy to
Yes, I can talk you through it. Can you talk yourself through it? This is the question. You see, no matter what I can do in myself or in relation to any one of you, it's of no use to you if it's just a momentary thing while you're sitting here in the room. It's of no value to you if you have to be sitting here listening to this talking head. You have to be able to do this yourself. You have to be able to recognize that you are the screen on which all of this is arising. Can you do that right now? How do you do that? Can you intuit the silence which you are, which is behind this? Let's not go out into the world. Let's just this right here, right now. Can every one of you intuit the silence which is behind what it is happening here right now? Is there some place, some state, some knowing which you have, that there is a peace and a calm within you? Sometimes it's easier in this environment, right? Because we have together established by our being here for the last hour or so, we've established this sense of external peace, of external calm. And so our internal presence, our internal peace and calm is somehow more easily seen through the support, through the intention of what we're all doing here. But you can also notice the way that the mind wants to become fascinated by whatever it is I'm saying. It wants to be able to grab the words, grab the concepts, hold to them, and somehow, like a lifeline, say, okay, just for this few minutes, I'm okay. Yeah? But I'm asking you to go deeper than that. What has brought you here today is not your suffering, it's your innate peacefulness. You can't often get to that if the mind is suffering. So you come somewhere where there is support for your inherent beingness, your inherent presence. Where somebody can say to you, yeah, I know that's your story, but I don't see that. I only see the beingness which you are. And this speaks directly to the heart. And you get closer and closer, more and more understanding about who you are in this way. Even though the mind keeps jumping up and saying, but, wait a minute, no, that's you, that's not me. Right? You know all these arguments?
There's a reaction in my mind to the simplicity of witnessing.
Yeah. If it can be said that there's one thing that you need to get under control in order for this to really take a deep root, it's already there, you see. It's just a matter of you developing the capacity to keep turning toward it until you don't need to do that anymore, until you just are that. But that one thing is reactivity. And so it's always good whenever you see any kind of reactivity in the mind to understand that it's there and give it a laugh and say, yeah, this is the mind which is trying to escape its natural silence. It does it very clearly through reactivity. How does it do that? It does it because what's happening is the mind is hearing something that's being said here as concept, right? And then the reactivity is a conceptual way of reacting to concept. See? This is a defense mechanism. Correct? Yeah, you can see that. Right? Yep. So we do this dance, week after week. But eventually, you come to understand that what's calling you is not these concepts. What's calling you is your own silence, your own peacefulness, your own inherent being. But in order for you to answer that call, you have to be willing to let go of these concepts. How do we do that? By noticing when reactivity rises, acknowledging that that's reactivity and I am not that, and coming back to the still point of awareing, or witnessing as you called it. And I want to remind you that this particular struggle that JB is involved in right now with the mind, it does not go on forever, but it's a necessary part of what you have to be willing to undertake in a persistent way in order for you to consistently and persistently hold to the silence of your own being. You will have to face every one of these kind of conceptual yeah buts. Every one of these conceptual reactivities. It's not going to go for most of us by one attempt. Why? Because we've allowed, embraced, and encouraged this kind of reactivity as a way of saying, this is who I am, throughout a lifetime. So we build up reactivity as a way of solidifying ourselves as a person or a personality, as a distinct and separate entity. This has gone on for a lifetime or perhaps many lifetimes. So it's going to take some persistence and some consistency throughout your days to remind yourself, this is all just life. And I am a dancer in this life. But at the base, at the foundation, I am that which is aware of everything which is happening here. And more than I am aware of everything that's happening here, I am everything that's happening here. I am all of this. There is nothing here which is separate from me. Not me in the small personality sense, in the sense of consciousness, being, and bliss.
In that reading, there were a bunch of I statements.
Yes.
And somehow while you were reading them, I was struck with the personal, that's not the way that, I don't know how to describe this linguistically, but that they were meant, those statements were for each of us to be experiencing as
Yes.
I.
Yes.
Yeah.
What is the nature of that I, though? This is a misconception.
Yeah.
This has to be looked at directly. What's the nature? When the Abadhut says I, what does he mean? When you say I, what do you mean? Are they the same?
Right, and when the Abadhut is that was intended for me to experience I that way.
Yes.
As it was stated, as opposed to I as an object over there talking to another I.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And there was a funny, it was happening when you were reading that, where it was like flipping for me.
Yes. But eventually it stops flipping.
Yeah.
And this is what we were talking about last week, what Stuart and I were
Yeah.
talking about last week, right?
Right.
Where this I of the Abadhut is understood to be being, consciousness, bliss. And the I, in terms of its usage, is a convention, right? It's not pointing to a personality. Ordinarily, if you say I, it's typically followed by I want, I need, have to have, I don't want, I don't like, this is the I of the personality associated with I am the body, or I am the mind. The Abhidhut, the sage, is always saying I as well, but in the case of the sage, there's no follow-on to the I. There simply is I am. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
I, in that case, is not a descriptive term in terms of personality. I is the recognition of all that is. And just like us, the Abhidhut, when wanting to express his or herself, must say, I'm going to the toilet now, if somebody wants to know, or must say, I have to do this at this moment. But this I is not taken to mean this personality. And this I has nothing to defend, and so its consequence is that sitting as I, as awaring itself, without aware of, just awaring, without any decision, opinion, compromise about what's being observed, this I simply is, and it cannot be seen, cannot be made into an object. It is what you are. So if you add absolutely nothing to the experience of awaring that you're having in this moment, then you are the self. So the difference between the Abhidhut I is the I of the self as compared to the I of the personality, which is what we are experiencing most of the time. But the fact that you are experiencing yourself as a personality or as a person has absolutely no bearing on the understanding I am. There's nothing you can do, say, be, or act in a certain way that will change the fact that you are that which is aware. You will be aware regardless. But once you come to understand I am that which is aware and to live as that awaring presence, everything changes.
As you're talking, it was really apparent how much fear I have of losing myself.
Very good.
And I could see that
Now don't follow that story. What's aware of that thought?
Exactly.
That I'm afraid of losing myself. End the story there with the question, and what is aware of this? You see, you can give up the need to explain yourself. You can give up the need to understand yourself. Now, I didn't say you will give up your understanding. I said you will give up the need to understand yourself. These are two very different things. In fact, your need to understand yourself is what prevents you from understanding. In the same way that your desire to know what awareness is, from last week, prevents you from understanding you are awareness itself. You are awaring. Now we get it.
It's always paradox in irony.
It's not always paradox. There was no paradox in your face at that moment. I saw that very clearly. There was no paradox there. The paradox comes from mind, thinking about it afterwards, in that moment of understanding. Yeah, just remain there now. Don't leave that. And you're finished. You will just live out your life if you remain in that space, in that place, as you are. Tryambakam yajamahe Sugandhim pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva bandhinam Mrityormukshiyamamritava Swaha Bhuva Bhu Om Sat Jung Hang Om. Namaste.
Thank you, JB. Thank you, Rishi. I'm going to be attending a family reunion of my deceased husband's this coming week, and this conversation is such a support for me to be there as I am, and not let my mind start trying to make. It's been kind of kicking up, trying to make problems and questions and things for me to figure out. It's been like, oh my gosh. And so it's really been, this has been such a good support as I continue to be as I am, wherever I am, whoever I'm with.
Yeah, that's a lot of gravity.
Mm-hmm. Or not.
Or not, yeah. In mind, that's a lot of gravity.
Yeah.
It's just another habit, this habit to anticipate. Yeah? You familiar with that habit? Sort of.
So very akin to planning.
Yeah, it's kind of akin to planning. Yeah. Usually planning is around trying to get around what you're anticipating.
Trying to control it.
Oh, yes, yes. Mm.
Well, this is the way that we build courage in this undertaking, right? Is to understand that we're this mind that anticipates everything or is trying to anticipate in any given situation is just coming out of its own self-interest. It's not necessary, really. It's usually driven by some sort of fear. Trying to, sort of like keep all the balls in the air, control all the variables. So it's a great thing to notice that the mind is anticipating and then to release that habit pattern and be willing to walk into circumstances, situations like you're talking about, especially with family. That's a big one. And just simply walk in as open-hearted awareness and see what unfolds. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, both of you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rishi. Thank all of you.
Mhm.
It's funny that you use that word gravity, because that's how I describe the benefit of coming here, is that it's like double or triple thought gravity. So somehow being in this physical room with people who are with calm minds feels like extra gravity to my thoughts, and it makes it easier for them to stop. Know what I
To
mean?
not fly away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know that habit of your mind to see shapes in clouds? You know, a cloud goes by and you can see a face or a silhouette of an animal or something. Your mind just does that. Today I've really been noticing my mind doing that with like making meaning out of like what's going on with this raven, like making a story out of it.
Yeah.
And like a blue car parked over here means that. Like I just see in my mind like making these shapes out of the clouds. And like, okay, dropping that over and over and over, like, wow.
So when you do that, are you beginning to experience the space that it creates for you when the mind doesn't need to interpret everything and find meaning in everything? That it creates a space? Are you comfortable in that space?
Yeah.
Yeah. Get more comfortable in that space. Yeah, nice.
It's really hard to, I guess not hard, that's not the right word, but it requires more focus when what's passing through is unpleasant,
Yes.
emotionally or physically. When I'm not in pain or I'm in emotional pain, then just hanging out in that presence is pretty easy, yummy, easy. But when there's like a, then I really have to remember to drop it over and over.
See, the reason this is called the path of wisdom, right, rather than the path of bhakti or devotion or the path of karma or effort, the reason this is called the path of wisdom is because, not just because we're going to pick up a whole new set of mental concepts and then we're going to try to become wise, but rather because it shows us, it teaches us to begin to look at the way that our minds operate in some way. And it's not necessary that we're looking at the mind and following it and telling ourselves a story about it. It's that just by this simple dropping that you're talking about, or this simple letting go, we come to understand the way in which the mind ties itself up in knots. And then the natural wisdom of this understanding flowers. People sometimes think, I've listened to many people over the years talk about how this path of wisdom is so difficult for them. And this is because they're trying to understand it all with mind and understand it all with concepts. Trying to undo the concepts that they already have in their mind with other concepts. But that's not the path of wisdom. The path of wisdom is the path of seeing directly. What is happening in this body-mind? What kind of reactivity is present?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what happens if I tell a story about what's happening with the crow or about the blue car parked on the corner?
Mm-hmm.
You know, how much of my life energy does that take up? And when do I get tired of doing that?
Mm-hmm.
You see? And then not allow that to go on, but not with a huge effort, just by the recognition that what needs to happen is, I need to come back to here now.
Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean like that the neuroticism disappears right away, though.
No?
But it's like as you stop pressing the gas pedal, and it's kind of slowing down on its own.
Yeah. But I do promise you that it's only temporarily while you're in the me state, the me-they state,
Mm-hmm.
the us-them state. Well, it's only when you're in that kind of duality that it feels like the gas pedal is being pushed. When you naturally begin to fall into your own inherent wisdom as being, consciousness, and bliss, you understand that that time was meaningless. You've always been this. You've never been anything but this. Even though, temporarily, you thought you were. You believed you were. So, what you're calling time, or you're saying it takes time, or it goes little by little, all of that in a one moment of recognition is wiped out. And all of that is gone. Then when someone says to you, what is this that you are? You simply say, I don't know, I've always been this. When the Buddha was walking down the road, the reason he's called the Buddha, some of you know this story, when he was walking down the road, someone came up to him and said, "Who are you?" And he said, Bud. This word, translated into English, simply means awake. He didn't even say, I am awake. They said, "Who are you?" And he said, awake. That's it. And from that position, one is always awake, has always been awake. There has been no gradual path and no sudden path. There's only awake.
There's a fair amount of hostility within culture towards awakeness. And awakeness abides in its own sense of reply, and culture has a meter to it that it wants its, and it has a conformity that it wants.
Yeah, that certainly has been true, especially in the past.
Yeah.
But I think it's also telling that to describe oneself or another as woke, in this culture, is becoming a common thing. And it's becoming a thing which is recognized. Now, it
Yes.
may not mean exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
So we can say perhaps there are degrees of wokeness,
Yeah.
and that's not the same as, a sage, or the same as a yoni, or the same as a Buddha. But understand that the way things work in a broad sense is that things come into the lexicon and into the understanding of in consciousness itself, apparently in small ways, and then begin to spread. And there is a tipping point.
Mm.
It's the same in culture as it is in you. You keep up this inquiry, and you see small changes. But if you look back over 10 years, maybe you say, oh, yeah, maybe I'm still not completely awakened yet, but I'm a whole bunch more awake than I was 10 years ago, or 20 years ago. This can be seen. So this is the same that's happening in the culture. So it is encouraging to me that there is this word, this position, this understanding is coming into the culture, that there is such a thing as being woke. Understand that 100 years ago, there was very, very few people who had the opportunity to hear what we're talking about. Even 40 years ago, when I began, or 50 years ago, it was really common to run into teachers who would not talk about the things we talk about here every week unless they were in private with you and you passed certain benchmarks. This was the way I began. And much of the teachings was considered still to be too revolutionary and too, I don't know what the word would be.
Esoteric.
That, but also just too
Controversial.
controversial, too much lending themselves to misunderstanding, to be spoken outside of a monastery or outside of an ashram, and even then outside of a room with one specific individual student to teacher. This was the way it was always transmitted for thousands of years. Now virtually all of this teaching is available on the internet. People can come to it in any way that they want. There is still a great deal of misunderstanding, but there is a whole bunch of people who are not misunderstanding. And this is yourselves included. So this is not us that's doing this. This is a movement in consciousness. It doesn't require us except as a vehicle for that movement in the waking state. You see? Which is what we're doing here. You know that you are aware when you're waking, dreaming, and sleeping. You can report on every one of those states the next morning. What it was like to be awake yesterday, aware yesterday, what it was like to fall asleep last night, what it was like to be in the dream state, what it was like to be in deep sleep where there's no body, mind is obvious, and yet there is this recognition that in that state I also was. I have not gone anywhere. The only reason I know I was in that state is because now I'm in the waking state, and so I can recognize, but that doesn't change the recognition that I am, or the recognition of awareness itself, that we are living awareness. It doesn't change. And you all know that. Now we can speak about these things, but in times past you could not speak about these things. And the most esoteric of these teachings were not even written down. They were transmitted only one person to one person. But now these teachings are readily available. So this is the movement of consciousness itself toward its natural state of liberation. So since this is your natural state, this state of liberation, why not be there? Why wait? Why delay it for one more piece of conceptual knowledge? Why not just put everything down and rest and know I am aware?